Thank you very much. Thank you so much for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank YAF for hosting. I want to thank Michigan State, obviously, for having me. And this is our, I think, 6th or 7th stop on the Covfefe on Campus tour. The Covfefe on Campus tour rolls along, and this couldn't have come at a better time because I had to get out of my studio. I had to escape the news cycle right now. All of those recounts in Florida. You saw the Democrat candidate for governor. He lost, and then he conceded, and then he unconceded because they found provisional ballots in a car somewhere at the airport in some Democrat's private vehicle. And so he unconceded. By the way, provisional ballot is when a Republican wins an election and then you have the provision to undo the election by finding more ballots. This is my fault. I did this. I didn't mean to do this. I sent out a tweet about a week ago that said, Republicans don't forget to vote on Tuesday and Democrats don't forget to vote on Wednesday. This was a little joke. It's kind of an old joke. I got banned from Twitter for this indefinitely until I agreed to waive my right to an appeal, take down the joke, kneel. So I said, okay, finally, I'll do that. The trouble is that the Democrats took my advice. The Republicans voted on Tuesday, and then, you know, the Republican candidates won. And then the Democrats showed up on Wednesday and they voted. They turned up on Thursday and they voted. I think they turned up this previous Wednesday, they voted again. They're still voting today. They're going to vote. They're going to keep voting until they shoehorn their guys into office. So I'm very sorry. If unfortunately, this election is stolen in Florida by the Democrats, I'm very sorry. This was my mistake. I promise, Rick Scott, I will make it up to you. So we've talked about a lot of topics on the Covfefe on Campus tour. We've talked about the simple joys of being right. We've talked about how to write nothing and sell 100,000 copies. We've talked about how to be a man when you look like a Maddow. I won't explain I disagree with the premise, but anyway. Now we are here because it is my mission to spread Covfefe to college campuses across the country because they need it. What is Covfefe, you ask? Covfefe is like pornography. You can't quite define it. You know it when you see it. It's something of an exuberance. It's something of a joy. It's something of this excitement that the right feels right now. And college kids really need it. Millennials really need it. I'm speaking mostly about left-wingers, but millennials are mostly left-wing, so that writes itself. They really need it because they're so miserable now. They're so unhappy. They're shrieking and they're complaining and they're yelling and they're screaming at Mitch McConnell in restaurants. Poor little cocaine Mitch. He's just sitting there trying to enjoy a nice plate of cocaine, and they come up to him, they come up to his wife, and they start screaming at him. And the guy, if you saw it, it's an older millennial guy, still a millennial, you know, and he says, "Why don't you get out of here? Why don't you get out of this whole country? I don't want you here, wow." And obviously all of the people in the restaurant say, "Shut up, sit down, go away." He's so upset, though. He can't get over it. This is true at my own dear alma mater of Yale. I feel another personal responsibility. I feel Yale really kicked off all this campus craziness a few years ago when they had the shrieking girl. Do you remember this girl? It was around Halloween time, and a Yale professor had the audacity to suggest that a 22-year-old Yale student could select his own Halloween costume. And this created an uproar. The girl screamed at her professor. She said, "You know, this is not an intellectual space. This is about creating a place of comfort and home for me." So that was embarrassing. Yale Law School isn't any better. During the confirmation battle of Brett Kavanaugh, where they dug up 35-year-old nothing, completely contradictory, made-up allegations that he did something at a party somewhere, sometime with somebody, there was a letter that Yale Law students wrote. It was written by law students, alumni, and professors. It said that if Brett Kavanaugh, a milquetoast federal judge, is confirmed to the Supreme Court, quote, "many people will die." They'll die. Now, he was confirmed to the Supreme Court. He's now been on the court for a few weeks at least. How are you feeling? Do you feel okay? Are you feeling healthy, safe? Okay? Nobody's died. I'm very pleased to see. I'm embarrassed too. I know a number of the people who signed that letter. I can tell you, they're not the happiest people. They're a little angry. They're a little miserable. They don't have the best. Why is that? We remember the girl they call Trigglypuff at the University of Massachusetts. She was so worked up because a conservative was voicing an opinion with which she disagreed, or with which she thought she disagreed. She probably couldn't even tell you what the opinion was. Millennials are catching a lot of flack. Rightly so. They're catching a lot of flack, and rightly so, because millennials broadly, but especially the left-wing ones, are coddled, undisciplined, uneducated, uncultured, ungrateful, overgrown children. This is not entirely their fault. It's actually not their fault. It's largely their fault, but not entirely, because they have very little context from which to draw. They have very little cultural inheritance. It's not their fault that they're poorly educated. It's their fault that they don't choose to educate themselves now, but they were poorly educated in school. It's not their fault that they're uncultured. It's not their fault that they were not disciplined as children. It's not their fault that they weren't taught gratitude, that they weren't given a firm foundation. Most importantly, though, for tonight, they are miserable. They're absolutely miserable. You don't need to just take my word for it. You don't need to accuse me of choosing isolated incidents of wacky Yale students who get excited about Halloween. This is proven out by social scientific data. There was a study that recently came out from Arizona State University. It showed that 25% of American college students are suffering symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder from the 2016 election. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, are they faking it? No. This is borne out in these social scientific data by showing that they are suffering clinically high levels of stress. They are suffering levels of stress that are similar to a witness of a mass shooting incident 7 months after the incident. That is real stress that they're feeling. It's bizarre. It's absurd. The reason that they're feeling that stress is because a Republican defeated a Democrat in an election. That's what happened. So, I'm willing to grant he's sort of a boorish Republican. He's a little bit vulgar. He's a little bit of an uncommon Republican. But nevertheless, a Republican wins an election, a quarter of young Americans start suffering from PTSD. Something is clearly terribly wrong, and we need to fix it as an act of charity for their sake. I'm not here just to make fun of them. That's about 50% of what I want to do. I want to help them as well. And it's worth pointing out, so Trump is maybe a little bit more boorish than other politicians, not more than Bill Clinton, but more boorish than some. He's also very successful. When you look around, the economy is doing very well. Joblessness basically does not exist. There are more open jobs than people looking for jobs. There's relative peace abroad. We're defending our allies. We're attacking our enemies. We're preserving peace in the Korean Peninsula seems to be improving. Obviously, North Koreans are cheaters, but things seem to be improving there. We've pulled out of the disastrous Iran deal. Things are going very well around the world, and it's not just Donald Trump. Things were going rather well even before Donald Trump. We are living at perhaps the most prosperous time, certainly the most prosperous time, and it seems also the most equitable and just time in all of human history. And yet millennials are hysterical. They're so upset. They're angrier than ever. And the misery is real. It is not a joke. The PTSD is real. The levels of stress are real. They're not just imagined. Now, of course, if you imagine that you're miserable, you probably are miserable. I don't know what the distinction really would be. But it's borne out even in the diagnoses. Millennials have been diagnosed at twice the rate of the average adult with depression and anxiety. The diagnosis of depression and anxiety is up 47% among millennials in recent years. There are a record high number of Americans on antidepressant drugs. About 1 in 6 Americans is on an antidepressant. This includes 1 in 12 Americans who are between the ages of 12 and 19. People who are prepubescent, pubescent, just post-pubescent. 1 in 20 of them are on antidepressant happy drugs. The majority of people who are on these drugs stay hooked on them for more than 2 years. They remain on those drugs. The New York Times, even the New York Times, which I rarely cite in any earnest way, declared in an op-ed that millennials are the antidepressant generation. The drugs are not curing the problem. They've been taking the drugs for a long time. They're still extraordinarily angry, and they shriek and they yell. So they're paralyzed by fear over trivial things. Why is this? They're paralyzed by fear over trivial things that adults are supposed to do. They've come up with a term for this, which is adulting. Have you heard the term adulting? This is one of my least favorite terms. Adulting, apparently, from what I can gather, it's not in any dictionary that I've seen. Adulting is when a millennial adult doesn't behave like a child, which is to say the expectation is that a millennial will behave like a child, but now they're going to occasionally pick up a tab for dinner or something, or maybe pay their rent, I don't know. There's an entire period now of post-adolescence, typically when people were adults in their 20s, which is now called emerging adulthood. They're emerging, they're evolving into it. When our grandparents were emerging into adulthood, they were storming the beaches of Normandy. Now we are occasionally paying for a month of rent, and that's it's emerging. Take your time. You'll get there eventually, but probably not. They're not getting there right now. So why is this? Where is this coming from? Materially, American millennials are the best off generation in human history. They have a magical device. Just to use an obvious example, they have this magical device where you can talk to someone on the other side of the world. You can see them. I think you can make a sandwich. You can check your email. You can watch a movie. You can type in Michigan State, it just takes you there somehow. And we're so well off. This is so convenient that when it glitches for 2 seconds, we start to yell at it. I do this myself. I say, you magical device, why aren't you doing all those things I need you to do and giving me the sum total of human knowledge now? You don't want to wait a second for that. That's how good we've got it. Now, normal people can catch themselves and say, this is not a real problem. I shouldn't really be yelling at my magical device. It's magical, after all, and it's doing a lot of things that I like. But millennials aren't able to do this, and this point is true broadly. The millennials who are shrieking and howling and wearing hats in the shape of genitals on their heads and moaning about Donald Trump or whatever they do, they need to look around and get a little bit of perspective and say, gosh, things are going pretty well. My life is pretty good. Everybody's life is pretty good. I can calm down. But they don't have that perspective. Why is it? There are a few reasons. One is education. Millennials are very poorly educated. They don't know anything. They've been through high school and in college broadly. They have had their education replaced by an ideological indoctrination. This is true in the study of civics, most obviously. This is true in history. This is true in the arts. People just don't know very much, and traditional disciplines have been replaced by ideological disciplines like gender studies and ethnicity, race, and migration studies. Whenever you see the studies at the end of a major, you can usually guess that it's not worth very much. What's kind of ironic, too, by the way, is that for all of the studies majors, they always really like the thing that they're studying. So, like women's and gender studies, really, it's all about how great women are, and, this studies and that studies, except for American studies. They hate American studies is the study of how terrible America is. But it's all ideology. The reason why that's true is it is all about ideology. This breeds a lot of ignorance. So just to throw out a few statistics that should terrify you. 1/3 of American millennials believe that President George W. Bush killed more people than Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. It's a real number. 2/3 of American millennials have never heard of Auschwitz. 22% of American millennials have never heard of the Holocaust. The majority of American millennials like socialism. That's the bad news. The good news is that only 32% of millennials can define socialism, which means there's a discrepancy there. That sounds about more correct to me. I was a little doubtful that many people knew what it was. This is where you get people like Alexandria Occasional Cortex, as my friend Steve Hayward calls her. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, where she says, we're going to pass Medicare for all. And she's asked for months and months on the campaign trail, how are you going to pay for that? She's asked by hostile reporters, by friendly reporters, and she didn't have an answer. Her first answer was that she's not the expert. And then she came up with she said, well, it'll be okay. And then Jorge Ramos, a very left-wing journalist, asked her, how are you going to pay? And she said, what a silly question. And then she rambled for about 5 seconds. And then she said, and we'll just do it. We'll just pay. We'll just pay. That is the sort of education we've gotten. I know this, by the way. I know the quality of education that a socialist like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez received because I grew up in the town right next to where she grew up. I know that she now pretends to be Jenny from the block, but she actually grew up in a very affluent suburb. She grew up in the richer town over from where I grew up, which was also a very nice place, and she didn't learn very much. This also breeds a lot of confusion. So right now, the majority of American millennials, or roughly half, believe that there are more than 2 genders. That there are more than 2. Facebook believes that there are 56. Well, they used to believe that there were 56. They changed a few years ago. You could select one of 56 genders on Facebook, and then they got rid of that. Oh, I said, okay, good, people are coming to their senses. They got rid of it because it was too few. There are now more than 56 genders. I wonder how many there are. I would ask the people who believe that there are more than 2 genders how many, if they could give me a precise number. Maybe we'll get to that in the Q&A later on. But in any case, they've erased it. Now you can fill in the blank. This breeds a lot of confusion because, according to one study, 12% of American millennials identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. I suppose by that latter definition, I could be gender nonconforming, given my Rachel Maddow glasses, you know, my relatively svelte physique. What does it mean exactly? It means that millennials are very confused because by all accounts, the number of Americans who suffer from gender confusion, transgenderism, gender dysphoria, who are men who think that they're women or women who think that they're men, is 0.2% to 0.4% of the population. At the high end, it's 0.4. And yet, 12% of millennials think this. Why? Because it's a fad and because they're confused. Where does this come from? It comes from the tyranny of relativism. It comes from what the English writer C.S. Lewis called the poison of subjectivism and what Pope Benedict brilliantly described as the dictatorship of relativism. He wrote that modern life is ruled by a, quote, dictatorship of relativism which does not recognize anything as definitive and whose ultimate goal consists solely of satisfying the desires of one's ego. This is, of course, right. This is all about ego. That's what it all boils down to. You see this most clearly in the identity politics. So right now, the reason the left, I think, gets so angry at conservatives, why study after study shows that left-wingers are more likely to unfriend conservatives on social media than conservatives are, is because left-wingers cannot separate the idea from the person who is thinking the idea. They identify themselves strictly with their ideas. They also do not have a barrier between the personal, the private, and the political. This was a major slogan that was brought into the left during the 1960s. The personal is the political. There is no separation between the two. If I don't like the way that you voted on Proposition 72, then you're dead to me. You're not my friend. Get off of my Facebook. I hate you. You're a wicked, evil, mean, bad person. There was a study that came out recently as well, which shows that the vast majority of Democrats believe that Republicans are racist, sexist, and bigoted. That number was half for Republicans considering Democrats. It seems that the majority now of Democrats attribute bad intentions, evil, to the people on the other side. I think it's because they don't understand what they're saying. This tyranny of subjectivism, this tyranny of the ego, comes out in their language a lot. So you'll hear, they frequently talk about my truth versus the truth. You're not allowed now to talk about the truth. That's so icky and assertive. You shouldn't be asserting anything. How dare you? You can only talk about my truth. They do it in language too. You'll find that they don't assert things. They're militant. They knock down Tucker Carlson's door. They harass Kat Timpf at bars in Brooklyn. And their elected leaders tell them to. They encourage them to. They say, go out, get at them in the street, go where they sleep. That's what Maxine Waters said. But the reason that they do this is because they want to hide it behind all of this language. So they'll say, they won't say, I think the sky is blue. They won't say, I believe the sky is blue. What they'll say is, I feel like the sky. Oh, I feel, isn't that? You can't disprove that because when you make a statement, when you make an assertion, when you state something as a fact or as a thought or as a belief, you have to defend that. It can be refuted. It can be disagreed with. But when you say, I feel like, well, there's no disagreeing. How could you? I don't know how you feel. You don't know how I feel. And they say like a lot. They infect all of their sentences with like. Like. This has gone on for a long time. The reason they do it is not just a random verbal tick, though it is a verbal tick. It's to separate the person from what the person is saying. So if you went to a party last night and it was cool, that's a statement. If you go to a party last night and it was like really cool, that separates you. It removes a level of seriousness. Even in their voices, this is true across left-wingers, I've noticed. They speak more regularly in vocal fry. Vocal fry, it's like when you talk like this, you know, and you just had a smoke of something, and I don't know, man. And they talk like this. It's also the way that typically young white girls are parodied as speaking like, you know, I mean, it's totally cool. And they do this because there is an apathy. There is an unwillingness to assert anything that you're talking about. All of this is in the name of relativism. All of this is in the name of multiculturalism. All of this is in the name of tolerance. But of course it leads to intolerance, because that sort of wicked relativism is itself an ideology. The ideology says there is no truth. Now, of course, that is a statement. It's a self-defeating statement. If you say there is no truth, then you can't say that there is no truth, because it would undermine itself. I think what the problem is for these young left-wing millennials is they don't understand that there is any thought outside of secular relativism. They don't realize that people might disagree with them. This is why they're always prattling on about tolerance, and then the minute you disagree with them, they stand up and they shout and they scream and they try to get you kicked off campus. So there are political and religious consequences to this sort of nonsense, because they don't know what they're rejecting. I think the reason why the majority of Democrats think that Republicans are racist, why left-wingers are more likely to kick out, to unfriend right-wingers on social media, is because they have no idea what they're talking about. And this was actually backed up by some social science as well. John Haidt showed a few years ago that right-wingers understand left-wingers much better than left-wingers understand right-wingers, which makes sense that they would have that sort of reaction. They talk about tolerance, but they have no idea that there are views that they must tolerate. They talk about diversity. They have no idea that people might disagree with them in a perfectly legitimate way. This is true of religion as well. And I think this actually gets down to the heart of why they're so miserable and why they're shrieking and yelling and wearing genitals on their head. As the Pew Research Center showed, right now, about 1/3 of American millennials claim to have no religion. A little higher, about 36%. They're some of the nones, religiously unaffiliated. This number is way up. In 2007, the number of Americans who had no religious affiliation was 16%. That number among millennials is now well more than double that. During that time, it's even worse, because during that time there's been a huge increase in the category of spiritual but not religious. This is my favorite category, spiritual but not. Because spiritual but not religious means that you find yourself very interesting, but you don't really care about metaphysical reality. But you know, man, you're really deep. You know, you're at a bar with a girl and you're just really deep. So maybe that's too harsh. I don't think so. On the bright side, what that means for those millennials is that they understand that there is a spiritual dimension of the world. This is obviously true, but it's become unfashionable in uneducated circles these days. The world is much more than material. Obviously it is. We're speaking right now. We're using words which are immaterial. We have numbers which are immaterial. We have morality, we have emotions, we have love, we have beauty. These are not material things. These are immaterial, metaphysical concepts. And so there is something beyond the physical. But these spiritual but not religious, religiously unaffiliated, coddled, whiny, screamy, uneducated millennials don't know about it. So should they? Do they identify as irreligious because they've studied their religions and have rejected them? No, of course not. A growing number of them have been raised without any religion at all. And for those who were raised nominally with a religion, very often it was akin to cafeteria Catholicism. You know, you have a nice meal every now and again, but you don't really take anything too seriously because nobody believes that sort of stuff anymore. The trouble is that irreligiosity makes people very, very miserable. There's also a lack of biblical literacy. I'll point that out. Just as a simple matter, the Bible is essentially the foundation of our entire civilization. All of our literature, our history, our politics comes from these biblical Christian and Jewish foundations, and people don't read it anymore. They actually are not brought up in an environment where they can read the Bible and quote it and be familiar with it, which is why they don't know much about anything else. When you are irreligious, you are less likely to be civically engaged. You're less likely to get involved in your community. You're much more likely to feel socially isolated. You're much less happy. And you're much more likely to be left-wing. That might be the worst one of them all. And you are much less likely to engage in behavior that will make you happy. The sort of behaviors that we keep putting off and off, like finding a spouse and getting married and being married to one person for the course of your life, or to settling down into a job and rooting yourself in an environment. These things are anathema to millennials. But then there's the big one. I suppose it ties in with not having a spouse, though not all the time. There was a major story that came out today in The Atlantic that shows that millennials who have all of these other problems, they're yelling, they're upset, they're uneducated, they don't believe in God, they think they're going to turn to worm food when they die. They've really got a lot of problems, and they're not even having sex. They are not even, there is a, to quote The Atlantic, sex recession going on in the United States. The title of the article is, Why Are Young People Having So Little Sex? You would think with 56 genders, it would be so easy, logistically, to find a partner with whom you could share a night of passion and romance. Apparently not. You would think with social mores so relaxed, with birth control abundantly available. Birth control, when I was in college, in every entryway, they had a bag of condoms. It's available anywhere. Anybody can get it all the time. You would think that that would be easy. And in a world where we have abortion virtually on demand everywhere, subsidized by taxpayers, you would think that this would be possible. In a world where Teen Vogue gives tips on how to engage in sodomy. That is a true story. You can look up the article. I don't recommend you look up the article, but you can. You would think that people would be bumping uglies a little bit more, but they're not. Why on earth is that? According to the Centers for Disease Control, between 1991 and 2017, the percentage of high school students who'd had sex dropped from 54% to 40%. Now, I would say this is good in a sort of moral sense, except they're not even religious. They're not even doing it out of a moral sense. I think they're doing it because they can't. People in their 20s are 2.5 times as likely today to be abstinent as people in Generation X. The average adult between 1990 and 2014 saw the number of times that they had sex per year drop dramatically. In 1990, it was 62 times per year. Not bad. Down to 54 times per year in 2014. This is not just true in the United States, this is true across the Western world. It's true in the United Kingdom, Finland, the Netherlands, and Sweden. It's especially true in Japan, which is an Eastern country, but it's been Westernized. And we've heard of this for years, that in Japan there has been a sex recession, fertility rates are extraordinarily low, huge numbers of millennial Japanese men would rather look at pornography than date an actual woman. And it's become a national crisis because the birth rate is so low over there. They're well under replacement. So what's to blame? There are a few culprits that we could name. Obviously, the usual suspects, porn, the hookup culture, and Tinder. Porn is the cause, I suppose, in Japan. The hookup culture is one where you are not incentivized in any way to have a long-standing relationship. And Tinder is there because you can always swipe right. The trouble with all three of those is that they're all a fantasy. Obviously, porn is a fantasy. The reality of porn, what you're doing, is you're lowering the shades, locking the door, and you're sitting alone with yourself and pleasuring yourself. Not very manly, not something you'd write home to grandma about and say, you'll never believe you're going to be so proud of me, what I did today. I don't think so. The hookup culture is another one. The hookup culture is so pervasive at this point. The trouble with the hookup culture is it's also a fantasy, because even if you've dabbled in it, you've enjoyed it, when you think back, you only remember the nights that went well, but you don't remember the nights that didn't go well. You don't remember the nights that you went home alone, or you went home wishing that you had somebody with whom you could share not just a night, but more than a night, maybe a life. When there was a study that was ascertaining how prevalent the hookup culture is, and people didn't know how to define relationships. So they didn't know if they could say, well, I'm going steady, but I'm not his boyfriend, or I'm not this, or whatever. And the question that got them was, if you had the flu, would your girlfriend bring you soup? I said, oh, no, absolutely not. Maybe you'd want somebody who would bring you soup. It's easy to blame those fantasies. I think that that's true. And obviously, Tinder is the one. I kind of missed that. I'm very glad that I missed Tinder, because for my friends, it sounds great, right? You're just swiping, meeting cute girls all the time. That sounds fabulous. Except what it really is a time suck. And the people behind Tinder and other online dating apps show that. They actually don't result in a terribly high number of people shacking up or getting married or even meeting in real life. They just swipe and they text and they swipe right again. And if you do happen to meet a nice girl on Tinder, the impulse to just swipe, it's all right there, is a tempting fantasy and ultimately not very conducive toward happiness. So, beyond those fantasies, I think the other major problem is that 1/3 of American adults under 35 live with their parents. This is a big millennial problem. 1/3 of them. That I know a number. I hope they're not watching right now. They'll feel like I'm making fun of them. But that's very much not good. 25% of fully employed millennials receive financial help from their parents regularly. Fully employed, not unemployed, not down on their luck, even though there's zero unemployment, so they should be able to get a job. Not students. Fully employed millennials, 1/4 receive financial assistance from their parents. This is horribly selfish. All of those other things are too. All of those other things that are totally ubiquitous in the culture, porn, hookup culture, Tinder, all of that, it's all about selfishness. It's all about this tyranny of relativism, this gratifying only the ego. Sometimes I'll hear this from millennial friends of mine who are living with their parents. They'll say, I'm just at my house right now. It's not your house, by the way, it's your parents' house. I'm just at my parents' house right now to save up money. But you're not saving up money. You're taking money from your parents in the form of rent and food and electricity and the internet and cable and whatever. You're taking that money and you're keeping it for yourself. There was no saving up a little bit of money into your 30s in the 1920s and 30s in America. That was not a thing. There has been a major cultural shift. All of this gets back to overgrown children and adulting. Where does it come from? Millennials have been protected from harsh realities. This is true on sports fields, it's true at school, it's true at home, it's true in finances, it's true even at work. We've got the participation trophies, we have rampant grade inflation, undisciplined, helicopter parents, financial dependence, and a low work ethic. The trouble is that you can't stay a child forever. This is Peter Pan syndrome. The flower will either bloom or the flower will die. If you try to stay a child forever, you'll be Peter Pan or you'll wind up like Michael Jackson. He was trying to be Peter Pan. It's ugly. It doesn't look good. You probably don't want to do it. And perhaps the most tragic cause of all is that I think these millennials don't understand the value of suffering. And my evidence for this, one, they've been protected against a lot of suffering, but also because of the way that the left speaks in language today. They treat victimhood as though it were a badge of honor. They create an intersectional hierarchy with special privileges. The more that you can claim that you are a victim of some outside group, that you whine, you moan, you blame, you excuse your own poor behavior and your own failures. You believe that suffering is morally wicked, that suffering and people who are suffering deserve some sort of special treatment. But none of this is true. None of this is the case. The reality of suffering is the exact opposite. Suffering can be a very good thing. Suffering has no moral quality. Everybody suffers. It's a broken world. We're out of the garden. Man is imperfect. We're never getting to paradise in this age. And so everybody's going to suffer. All that matters, all that has a moral quality is how you react to suffering. You can react like a little whiny whatever with a pink hat on and complain because your parents didn't pay enough of your rent this month, or you can behave like an adult. You can start adulting. And when you react to suffering in that way, it makes you better. It is a sanctifying experience. It turns you into an adult. Cynical politicians fan the flames of all of this. Joe Biden in 2012, he accused Republicans of wanting to put black people back in chains. That's what he said, because there wasn't enough suffering, there wasn't enough actual victimhood, so he had to invent it. He had to say, those Republicans, the Republicans who founded their party to free all the slaves, and then they freed all the slaves, and then they passed the first civil rights bill over the veto of the Democrat president, and then they passed another 6 civil rights bills up to 1991. That Republican Party, they want to put you all back in chains. The left makes a line, they say, without government programs, you won't be able to live. You need us. You need us. Come on, suckle on the teat of government. Kanye West pointed this out in the Oval Office in one of the most entertaining exchanges in modern politics, when Donald Trump was able to sit across the desk from Donald Trump, and you got to talk to each other and say, gosh, is this what I sound like? Is this what I... And Kanye West was sitting there, and he mocked the welfare state, and he assailed liberals, to use his word, for breaking up the black family, for getting people hooked on programs that would destroy their happiness. The cynical left preys on these gullible, impressionable millennials, these ignorant, overgrown children, because they want to keep them children. The left wants to keep you a child and whining and giving excuses and pretending that your life is bad when you've got a really nice life around you. This is the great achievement of the Trump era, the end of a cultural malaise. During the Obama administration, we heard that you didn't build that. There was no growth. Hey, Barack Obama, how come there's no growth? Oh, well, because there's never going to be growth again. Hey, Barack Obama, how come your economic recovery hasn't produced any jobs? Oh, there aren't going to be any more jobs. Jobs were in the old way, and now there's no more jobs. It's just natural. That's how now, of course, we have zero joblessness. The best days were behind us. Barack Obama said to get used to terror attacks. Terror attacks are just sort of a normal thing. They're just going to happen. We just have to get used to them, not overreact. Get used to having less freedom. The left has been saying this since at least Woodrow Wilson. The left has been saying this for a century. Oh, the presidency's too big for one man. Oh, the modern world is too complicated to have any sort of freedom. Don't buy it. It's total nonsense. And the end of this cultural malaise that we're experiencing right now tells you we can win. We can achieve, we can defeat our enemies abroad, we can grow, we can, to quote our president, make America great again. So when your hysterical classmates whine and they tell you the sky is falling and everything is awful and there's oppression everywhere and look out behind that door, there's some oppression, don't indulge it. You should laugh at it. You should correct it. But you should also help them out because they're like little children and you should, like a child, you wouldn't be mean to a child. You just want to help them out and raise them up a little bit. Don't indulge them. The inmates cannot run the asylum. The children cannot run the nursery. There must be an adult in the room. You must be firm, you must be assertive, and you must behave like civilized people. That is the only hope that we have of getting all the little overgrown kids to start adulting. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we're going to open it up for some questions. We certainly have plenty of time for a few questions. We have a rule at the Daily Wire, which I hate. I despise this rule because I think it creates bad incentives, but I don't write my own checks, so we got to go with it. If you disagree with me, you can cut to the front of the line. I will talk to you first. This is a dialogue. We're here for free speech. So if you disagree with me, come to the front of the line and we can talk.
So Dinesh D'Souza was here a couple weeks ago. I asked him a similar question to the following. Do you think that with the amount of left-wing ideologies being propagated in academia, that the change that we eventually hope to see will come more from the students or the administration?
The administrators have lost their minds at certain universities, like my own, like Yale. The administrators have been very good at other universities, like Purdue, where Mitch Daniels is the president. I think the real issue, though, is that the administrators and the professors are not doing their jobs broadly. The children can't raise themselves. It's very hard for a child to raise himself. You need a parent or a relative or a grandparent or just some adult to raise you. And until we solve that problem, then we're not going to correct this issue of uneducated, miserable millennial kids. Now, there have been certain ways to solve this outside of the university. There have been good programs during the summers. There have been good fellowships. There have been good extracurriculars. That's all great. You can bring speakers through the Young Americas Foundation. There are some ways to help correct it, but unfortunately, to use Roger Kimball's phrase, we have tenured radicals at the universities, and as long as they are given free rein, I don't see the situation improving.
Hi, Michael. I actually have a disagreement. I thought he did, so I didn't cut in front of him. You're fine.
Typical Republican trying to steal.
Yeah, so I just thought some of your facts might have been misrepresented. For instance, you said there are just a lot of genders, and I felt like you tried to say millennials all subscribe to the 57 plus genders and such, but you just said your basis for that was how Facebook had that many genders listed, but there weren't really any stats about people millennials who actually believed it.
There was one statistic, which is that 12% of millennials identify as transgender or gender nonconforming, whatever that is to mean. That is a very high number. That's higher than the number of transgender people we have in the country, which is statistically 0.2 to 0.4%. That is much, much higher. It seems like the confusion among millennials is very widespread.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I don't know. I must have missed it. Thanks.
I have a very sonorous voice. It sometimes lulls people to sleep. It might have been that.
Hello, Michael. Thank you for speaking here today. My question revolves around, I was raised in Catholic school my entire life, and yet I see many of my so-called Catholic friends turn to the left and be politically liberal and just generally not conservative. And my question was, Why do you think that is? Why do you think we have so many people coming out of private schools turning far lefter than even some people out of public schools?
Conservatives tend to be contrarians. I've noticed this. You would have to be a contrarian these days in order to be a conservative because the culture is so profoundly left-wing. This is true of Catholic schools. There is always a joke. If somebody comes up to me and says, I went to Catholic school, I say, oh, you must be an atheist now because they had some bad experience with a nun when they were 10 and now they hate all of Catholicism. And because they're not aware of the perhaps intellectual or spiritual roots of their faith. They didn't have a strong foundation to begin with and therefore they fell away. This is also true in politics, but people have to grow beyond that, hopefully. And I will simply point out, though, that the contrarian character of the broad conservative movement today is a great help because when you are in a culture where everybody agrees with you, like a left-winger on a college campus, you don't have to question any of your ideas. They are just like in the air. It doesn't matter at all. When you're a conservative, you constantly have to defend everything you believe. Why did I cite so many statistics in my discussion tonight? I don't even really buy social science. I think most of it's bunk and politicized, but I'll have to cite it when it suits my purposes because you constantly need to be able to recite facts and defend what you believe. This is a great help because it makes you reconsider what you think. I've changed certain views. I've moved to the right on certain views. I've moved a little bit to the left on other views. Our friends on the left don't have that advantage. They don't get that privilege. I think we should use it for everything it's worth.
How you doing, Knowles? So you touched on dating with millennials, and I found I've had a problem with this. So my other friends about finding women who have similar values as us. So you touched on it, but you never really gave a whole lot of advice on how to actually go about solving that issue.
I'll try to set you up. I'll say, you're about, what did you say, about 6 feet? And yeah. This is a tough one because my opinions about the world have changed over time. My wife's opinions about the world have changed over time. We've been together for a long time. I couldn't tell you the secret to love. If I could, I'd at least be a famous songwriter or something, but I'm not. One issue, though, is I think the difference between a disposition and an ideology. So I know people who are left-wing in their ideology, but they have a relatively conservative disposition. They're not the shrieking people. They don't go out and yell and attack politicians at restaurants. They have a bit of a more conservative disposition. Those people can be reasoned with. And I know right-wingers who have a radical disposition. So I think you want to be able to find somebody who sees the world, who's at least looking at the same thing that you are looking at. Might not see it exactly the same way, might be looking at it from a slightly different angle. I think that's important. I miss the dating apps, so I don't know if the swiping is going to help you very much. I can't imagine that they're good because in real life, that's where you're going to meet a person. You're not going to meet a person texting them. You're not going to get to know a person that way. You're going to get to know a person in real life. So I would recommend the best advice I can give to you is start looking for them in real life and be open to it. Don't limit yourself. Sometimes I have people write into me. They say, oh, I really like this girl, but she voted for Rand Paul and I voted for Marco Rubio, so she's dead to me. You think, come on, man, lower your threshold a little bit. I mean, give people a little grace. Oh, well, she doesn't have exactly the religious views that I have. And well, that's fine. Then talk about it. And maybe you'll come to the same conclusion. Maybe you won't. But if you're a conservative guy on a college campus, I bet you're persuasive enough to bring a lady over to your way of thinking. And I would approach things in that way. Be open. Cole Porter didn't write the song, let's do it, let's be in a relationship. He didn't do that. He said, let's do it, let's fall in love. And you want to be open to love and deal in that way. Men tend to be more romantic, capital R in their notions than women are. And so you be a little bit romantic. You don't need to be digging through apps to find a woman. Just look around the world. There are plenty of cute ladies walking around.
Hey, just want to preface this by saying I guess I'm your outlier because I met my girlfriend on Tinder and we've been dating for over 2 years now. So
congratulations. I was just at a wedding of a couple friend who met on Tinder. It does happen, not all the time, but it definitely does happen. It's nice when it works out.
So you mentioned a lot about a lot of mental illnesses. You talked a little bit about it. This is the antidepressant era, and how a lot of millennials suffer from PTSD after Trump's election. Do you think that just the millennial culture itself is mentally masochistic?
It might be. It might have this Marquis de Sade quality to it. Oh, yeah, elect Donald Trump again. Yeah, that feels good. Ouch, ouch. I don't know. Perhaps it could. I suggest that it comes from a weakness and a narrow-mindedness, which is ironic because they call us narrow-minded, and yet we can tell them what they think, and they can't tell us what we think. It's from a real narrow-mindedness. And this happens at different points in life for various people. I can remember distinct moments when my mind opened, when I saw a new way of thinking, when I realized I had been wrong about something. I suspect for these kids, they haven't seen that, and especially because they don't have a religious foundation that explains the metaphysical foundations of the world, that explains our fallen human nature, that explains why we suffer, that explains why it rains on the just and the unjust alike, that in the face of suffering, they are totally lost. They are shocked, they're horrified, they have nothing to turn to, nothing to explain it. It's chaotic and it's fearful because they don't understand it. This is the great error of raising children without any religion. I'm not even saying you need to raise them in the right religion, but you at least need to get them familiar with the questions that one can ask, which are eternal questions that can help them face their broken human nature. And if they're not going to start doing that, then I fear we're only going to see the diagnoses of depression increase and the happy pills increase, and yet nobody getting even one iota happier. All right, one more.
All right.
I like your cape.
Thank you. It's a flag.
What's the flag?
Soviet flag.
Oh my gosh, that's not good. I take it back.
Anyways, so you claimed that the reason that there are more transgender people now is because they are more confused. Even today, the hate crimes against transgender people are much higher than those against any other demographic. So is it not more likely that there are more transgender people now because...
Are there more hate crimes in the United States against transgender people or Jews?
I'd guess transgender, but I am not sure.
You are certainly not sure. That's right. It's the answer is Jews.
Okay.
That'd just be a numbers thing, though. Like, you're like,
It is a numbers thing,
only
but you
1
cited a numbers thing, so then I'm
like,
citing a
if
different numbers thing.
0.1% of people in America are transgenders, then yeah, like 100% of them could be like affected by crimes, and only 1% of
Well,
people
we're getting very confused with our numbers. If you're saying it's 0.1% of Americans are transgender, we've also heard it's 0.2 to 0.4%, and now we're hearing that 12% of American millennials identify as transgender or gender nonconforming. So what number is it? I'm certainly confused, and it seems to me that these people are very confused as well.
Is it not, though, more likely that people are identifying as transgender now because of a decrease in the percentage of hate crimes as opposed to previous decades?
Well, the identification is part of the confusion because a man isn't a woman and a woman isn't a man. That's the confusion. I see you were confused by my apparently confusing statement, but let me make it abundantly clear. A man cannot be a woman and a woman cannot be a man. There is sexual difference. The sexes are not indistinguishable. They're not indiscernible. And there's a great confusion in our culture that men can be women, but they can't.
All right. As a self-proclaimed liberal leftist, where did my education go wrong? I've read like Hobbes, I've read Locke, I've read Smith.
Well,
I've
that
read
might be
Plato.
where Hobbes might have been a good start. Finish your question.
I mean, yeah, but Hobbes is very like authoritarian, like kings. Like you wouldn't definitely leftists would not describe themselves as Hobbesian. So I don't think
And
my
yet
reading of
Hobbes might have been the
Leviathan-
first proto-liberal.
I mean, I don't think my reading of like the Leviathan said like, yeah, I love a king, therefore I'm gonna go vote like liberal. Like, no, I don't love this idea of like, yeah, we all need to get behind a leader and then like we don't question him because like, okay, we just came out of a civil war, like English Civil War. So I'm just confused. Where did my education go wrong? That
is
I'm
where your
stupid. Where
education-
am I stupid now? So
That,
reading
I'm not
Hobbes.
saying that you're stupid, but that is where your education went wrong because you just attempted to show me that you have read all of the great thinkers of political philosophy. You've read Hobbes. You've read Locke. You've only read modern writers. Have you read Thomas Aquinas? Have you read Aristotle? Have you read Plato?
Plato, the Republic. I read Aristotle. I'm reading the Ethics right now by Aristotle.
Excellent.
currently.
You might enjoy it. I'm not making the point on your own education. I don't know about your education. But broadly speaking, we have narrowed our field of education to a very minor era, which is the modern era, which is liberalism, which is the fruits of liberalism, which are in these modern ideologies. I would that more people read Locke and Rousseau and Hobbes and Mill. That would be wonderful. That would go a long way toward fixing the problem. If everybody read all the books that you've read, that would go a long way toward fixing the problem. But I fear they don't even read that. I fear that in especially these ideological disciplines, they're not even reading great thinkers such as Hobbes. They're reading very modern thinkers, and they're being instilled and imbued with ideology. The way to break out of that is to read other people and to read other perspectives and to talk to other people as well. Whether they're going to do that, I don't think so, because all we see, especially on social media, is people further isolating themselves, putting themselves into greater echo chambers. So it's great that you're a liberal and you came out to watch this talk tonight. How many other liberals are in the room? Not a ton, a few. We got a few, that's great, but not a ton. It would be wonderful if more of your friends came out and saw it, but at least you did. You're giving us hope for the left.
Glad I can give hope to the good side.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank you guys for coming out and being civil. I know everybody here appreciates civil discourse, and Michael has had way worse people who have come and shouted him down before.
Yeah, well, that's
So I know
certainly
this
true.
is-
Yeah,
this
you
is-
guys-
This is great. Yeah.
This is amazing. I mean, this is a wonderful thing. We have left-wingers coming out, not shrieking, not crying, not yelling, not interrupting the speech. This is a testament to your side of the political aisle. I hope others are watching, but they're not. All the ones are on YouTube now. Why weren't you yelling at him? Why didn't you start screaming? It was very good. I appreciate your being here.
Anyway, but on a less serious note, Christmas is 41 days away. When is the appropriate time to start listening to Christmas music?
Do you want the real answer?
I want the real answer.
After Christmas.
Really?
That's the real answer. That's the real answer. Sometimes I break that. In the old days, I'm older than most of the people in this room, there was a season called Advent, which was coming up, and you were waiting for the birth of Christ. And this was this wonderful, solemn period, and you're awaiting the incarnation, this miraculous event in the world to redeem mankind. And now, on November 1st, I was sitting in my Starbucks, and they're playing that Mariah Carey song as though it were Christmas Day already. That's the real answer, though it is acceptable. And this is what I do too, because nobody's perfect. To start listening the day after Thanksgiving. That is the acceptable time. At no time before that can anybody listen to any Christmas music.
I respectfully disagree, but that's okay.
What's your answer?
November 1st.
November. This is a guy who would wear a shirt that says, "I fired Michael Knowles." That's the kind of guy that this is.
Thanks for coming out.
It's a good question, yeah.
All right, our last question.
So one of the specific things I like to read a lot, and I read this book this summer, and it was called The End of Power. And that shows the trends on how we are typically, like in society as a world and a whole, we're going more toward limited government and more toward giving power to the people, not only in politics, but in the boardroom and all over the world. And I'm not seeing this trend as much in colleges, but I also want to know, do you see this trend happening more in colleges now? And will it further? And do you see this trend continuing as we go on?
I see this trend happening in colleges if the people are utterly useless administrators and deputy assistant deputy deans of nothing and inclusion. I think they're getting a lot of power on campuses. What I'm noticing, though, is that students aren't getting too much power. The small groups of students that protest and ruin it for everybody else are getting a lot of power, but the majority of students are being denied their right to an education that they're paying a lot of money for. I'm seeing professors losing a lot of power as well, also to those awful, useless administrators who are wasting resources and ruining education. And I'm seeing alumni have very little power at universities now as well because of the bureaucratization of universities and because they've injected politics into all of it. I think it's awful. I can't wait. If you make me president of the university, my first day I will go with a bulldozer to whatever the deputy dean of deputy diversity and deputy inclusion or whatever it is, and I will bulldoze that building to the ground, and then we will restore power to the people who should have it at universities. All right, thank you very much. It was so nice to be here. Thank you.